Music is not medicine. The Duke of Ravensmere told Mariam Cole before she had removed her gloves. He stood in the shuttered music room with dust, silvering the black pianoforte, and his 16-year-old sister watching from the doorway. Lady Eleanor has not spoken in 11 months. I will allow 4 weeks of lessons, after which I expect you to admit what the physicians already know. Mariam met the gaze of the cold man who had hired her to confirm his hopelessness. She was a full-figured black woman in a plum traveling dress, 29 years old, carrying one leather folio and no intention of pretending certainty. I do not cure people, Your Grace, she said. I teach them how to be heard. If you require a miracle, dismiss me now. If you require patience, open the shutters. Julian Ashford, Duke of Ravensmere, opened them because Eleanor did. His sister crossed the room, took the first latch in both hands, and forced it upward before he could object. March light entered in a pale sheet, revealing covered chairs, warped music stands, and the portrait of their mother above the mantel. Eleanor did not look at the portrait. She looked at Mariam, whose expression held neither pity nor triumph. Then she opened the second shutter. Julian stood very still. In 11 months, his sister had refused every direct request made by physicians, relative, and himself. The stranger had made no request. She had named a condition under which work could begin and allowed Eleanor to choose it. Ravensmere Hall had been silent since the carriage accident. Julian's parents died when the vehicle overturned on the western road during a storm, and Eleanor was pulled from the wreck with a broken wrist, a deep cut along her temple, and no voice anyone could persuade her to use. She could speak physically. The physicians agreed on that. She coughed, laughed once in fever, and cried out in sleep. Awake. She communicated through nods, gestures, and the small slate she carried on a ribbon. The family called it stubbornness when they were impatient, and shock when they wished to sound kind. Julian called it a problem, because problems suggested solutions, and solutions were easier to bear than grief. He had been 34 when the title arrived with 2 coffins and a sister who stared through him. He had left the army 3 years earlier, after a shoulder wound, expecting to manage one modest property, while his father continued the dukedom. Instead, he inherited Ravensmere, Isatenant, its debts, and every relative's opinion about Eleanor. He answered by becoming exact, meals at fixed times, accounts reviewed each morning, doctors consulted, replaced, and consulted again. He guarded his sisters so fiercely that he began deciding what she could endure before she had a chance to tell him. Mariam knew nothing of the accident beyond Mrs. Penrose's careful letter. The housekeeper had written to a Bristol music master after hearing of a teacher who used rhythm and notation with pupils who found speech difficult. The master was dead. His daughter continued the work. That daughter was Mariam, born above a chapel vestry to an English mother who sang alto, and a West African father who had arrived in Bristol as a sailor, become a free clerk, and eventually served as organist for a small dissenting congregation. Mariam had his ear, her mother's patience, and a body society repeatedly mistook for evidence of indulgence rather than strength. She had learned to let other people's first judgments spend themselves without funding them. She placed her leather folio on the dusty pianoforte and opened it. Inside were blank sheets, ruled with musical staves, several pencils, a tuning fork, and a small wooden metronome. Eleanor approached. Her dark hair was cut shorter on one side where the wound had healed, and she held her left wrist close to her body, though the bone had set. Mariam did not ask whether she wished to play. She struck the tuning fork lightly against her palm and set its base on the piano case. The note vibrated through the wood. Eleanor touched the case and felt it. Mariam tapped 3 slow beats on the lid. Eleanor watched. Mariam tapped them again. After a long pause, Eleanor answered with 2. Julian felt irritation rise. The familiar rage of a man watching tiny gestures while months disappeared. "What does that mean?" he asked. Mariam did not turn. "At present, it means," she answered. "With 2 beats?" "Yes." She looked at him then. "If you intend to measure every first step against the destination, your grace, you will make movement feel like failure." Eleanor's eyes flicked toward her brother. Something there was almost humor. Julian recognized it too, and disliked the gratitude he felt toward a woman who had rebuked him in his own house. Mariam's first condition was that the music room belonged to Eleanor during lessons. No physician might observe from behind a screen. No aunt might enter to test progress. Julian could attend only if Eleanor placed a chair for him. "She is my sister," he said, "and she is my pupil." Mariam replied, "Those facts can cooperate if you allow them." Eleanor walked to a chair, dragged it across the floor with difficulty, and set it outside the threshold. Then she looked at Julian. Mariam's face remained composed. "Mrs." Penrose looked down to hide approval. Julian left. In the corridor, he told his butler the teacher would not last a fortnight. Mr. Pritchard, who had served the Ashfords for 30 years and had survived Julian's adolescence, accepted the prediction without visible belief. "Very good, Your Grace." Julian heard the silent addition anyway. He went to the estate office and spent the next hour reading the same rent summary twice, while faint. Uncertain piano notes traveled through the opened music room shutters, and along the eastern passage, Mariam did not begin with scales. She began with choice. She wrote 3 words on separate slips: loud, soft, stop. Eleanor selected soft, then stop. Then, after several minutes, pushed stop aside and chose loud. Mariam played 1 chord. Eleanor flinched, then struck the same chord with her uninjured right hand. The sound was ugly, crowded, alive. Mariam wrote it as 3 black notes in the blank folio, and beneath them added the date. She slid the pencil toward Eleanor. The girl hesitated, then drew a single vertical line after the chord. A bar line, creating an ending. It was the first mark in a conversation neither woman required to resemble speech. By the end of the first week, Eleanor had created 6 rhythmic signs. 2 taps meant again. 3 quick taps meant no. A palm flat on the piano meant too much. A descending pair of notes meant leave me alone, and was used most often when Julian appeared in the corridor. Mariam did not translate every sign for him. "They are hers," she said when he asked. "She will decide which ones become household language." Julian stared at the closed music room door. "How am I to care for her if I do not know what she means? You could begin by asking rather than requiring." He did ask that evening at dinner. Eleanor sat at his right in the small family dining room, her slate beside her untouched plate. Julian had developed the habit of filling silence with practical information. The mayor was recovering. Aunt Beatrice would visit Tuesday. The weather might delay the south roof repairs. That night, he stopped. He placed 2 fingers on the table and tapped 3 slow beats, copying Mariam's first question. Eleanor looked up. He felt absurd. Then she answered with 2 beats. He did not know what they meant. He asked, "May I learn?" Eleanor considered him, wrote in careful chalk, "Not yet," and returned to her soup. The refusal hurt. It also contained more relationship than obedience would have. Mariam remained after the fortnight. Julian did not mention his prediction. Pritchard did not mention it either, which was more pointed. The music room changed under her direction, but not through decoration. The heavy curtains were cleaned and rehung. One cracked chair was removed. The pianoforte was tuned. Eleanor chose which portraits stayed. She covered her father's with a length of linen, left her mother's visible. Then, on the following day, covered that one too. Julian discovered it and ordered the linen removed. Mariam replaced it before Eleanor returned. Those portraits are family history, he said. They are also two dead faces above the only instrument she is willing to touch. She cannot erase them. No. She can decide when they watch her. Julian's anger sharpened because her sentence touched the place where his own grief hid. You exceed your position. Mariam stood beside the covered portrait, hands folded at her full waist. My position is to make this room usable to my pupil. If you want a shrine, employ a curate. Eleanor appeared at the doorway during the last words. She crossed to the mantel, took the linen from her mother's portrait, folded it, and left her father's covered. The choice ended the argument more completely than rank could. Julian began to observe from the hall. He told himself Eleanor had not invited him. Mariam knew he was there, and neither welcomed nor dismissed him. He watched her teach rests as carefully as notes. When Eleanor became frustrated, Mariam did not soothe her into helplessness. She waited. When the girl struck the keys hard enough to hurt her wrist, Mariam caught the hand, not gently, and said, "Pain is information, not punishment. We stop before it becomes damage." Eleanor glared, then wrote something in the folio. Mariam laughed. Julian had not heard what was written, but his sister's shoulders loosened at the sound. One morning, the music stopped abruptly. Julian found Mariam in the corridor, holding the folio against her chest, while Eleanor locked the door from inside. "What happened?" "She asked me to leave." "Why?" "Because I corrected her." Julian reached for the handle. Mariam stepped between him and the door. She was shorter than he was, broader through the body, immovable in a way that did not require force. "She is angry, not endangered. She has locked herself in a room with 2 exits, no fire, and a bell pull. Give her the dignity of a temper." They waited on opposite sides of the corridor. 5 minutes became 10. Julian's injured shoulder began to ache. A familiar warning of rain. "You are very certain," he said. "No. I am willing to be uncertain without making it her emergency." The distinction silenced him. After 17 minutes, the lock turned. Eleanor emerged, handed Mariam the folio, and tapped 3 quick beats on its cover. "No." Mariam nodded. "Then we do not repeat the passage today." Eleanor pointed at Julian's shoulder. Then at the window where rain had begun. He realized she had noticed him rubbing the old wound. She took his arm and led him toward the library. It was the first time in months Eleanor had initiated contact. Julian followed, without speaking. In the library, she placed him in his father's worn chair, fetched the small cushion Mrs. Penrose used for sewing, and wedged it behind his shoulder with impatient efficiency. Then she wrote on her slate, "Stop before damage." Mariam stood at the threshold. Julian read the words twice. His sister had borrowed the teacher's rule and used it to care for him. "Thank you," he said. Eleanor tapped 2 beats on the chair arm. This time, Mariam translated, "Again." The leather folio became the center of Eleanor's new language. She filled pages with short patterns and notes, sometimes conventional, sometimes invented. Mariam dated every page and never tore out a failed attempt. When Julian asked why errors remained, she said, because progress without its earlier shape becomes a performance. He thought of his estate accounts, where revised totals replaced messy calculations. He thought of family letters, chosen for preservation because they made the dead appear simpler than they had been. "You prefer inconvenient records," he said. "I prefer records that admit people were present." Their conversations moved from Eleanor to music, and from music to the habits by which people protected themselves. Julian learned Mariam disliked praise that floated free of evidence. Remarkable meant little to her. You waited through the silence meant something. Mariam learned Julian played the cello badly, but with dedication until his father declared the instrument unsuitable for an heir and locked it away. She asked whether it remained in the house. He said the attic. The next day, it stood in the music room, dusted but unopened. Eleanor had found Pritchard and directed the removal herself. Julian entered during a lesson to find the cello resting beside the pianoforte, and his sister seated with a challenge in her eyes. Mariam held out the bow. "Absolutely not." Eleanor tapped 3 quick beats. "No." Then she pointed to the chair she had placed inside the room. Julian looked from chair to bow. "This is coercion." Mariam's mouth curved. "It is an invitation with a clearly expressed preference." He sat. The first note he produced scraped like a saw. Eleanor covered her ears theatrically. Julian stared, then saw the small, wicked light in her face and laughed. The music room, closed for 11 months, held all 3 sounds. At once, the bad cello, Mariam's warm contralto counting time, and Eleanor's silent laughter. By April, Eleanor played one complete piece with both hands. A simple air their mother had taught them as children. Her injured wrist tired quickly, and Mariam altered the left-hand pattern rather than demand the original. Julian objected that his mother had written it differently. Eleanor stopped playing. Mariam turned on him. "Your mother composed for the hands she had. Eleanor must compose for the hand she has now." He heard the greater truth and did not defend himself. "Show me," he said. Eleanor stared at him. Then she played the altered pattern. It was simpler, darker, and more beautiful. Afterward, Julian found Mariam at the music room window, looking over the rain-dark gardens. "I am sorry," he said, "for interrupting, for treating memory as a law she had broken." Mariam glanced at him. "That is a precise apology. I have been told floating praise is useless. You have been listening." The words warmed him more than forgiveness would have. He wanted to touch the loose curl near her cheek. Wanted it with a force that made control feel suddenly less like strength. He put his hands behind his back. Mariam noticed both the impulse and the restraint. Her gaze softened. Not as reward, but recognition. Sir Edmund Ashford arrived in the final week of April. He was Julian's father's cousin. A smooth, silver-templed man who served as co-trustee of the funds left for Eleanor until her 21st birthday. He brought gifts, legal documents, and the air of someone entering a room he had already arranged. Edmund had urged from the beginning that Eleanor be placed at Larkhaven, a private establishment for nervous young ladies in Surrey. Julian had refused, while he believed home and physicians could restore her. Now Edmund returned with letters from 2 specialists stating that prolonged muteness indicated instability, and that attachment to an unlicensed music teacher might deepen delusion. Mariam met him at luncheon. Edmund's courtesy was perfect enough to cut. He asked where she had trained, whether the Bristol congregation had been respectable, and whether pupils commonly became dependent on her. He never mentioned her race directly. He allowed questions about breeding, suitability, and certain provincial freedoms to do the work. Mariam answered only what concerned Eleanor's lessons. Julian interrupted twice, defending her qualifications. But each intervention made her feel more like a subject under examination. Afterward, she said, "Do not fight every insult as though I were absent." He replied, "I will not permit him to speak to you that way. Then ask me which words require your answer." Edmund requested to inspect the folio. Mariam refused. "It contains Lady Eleanor's private work. I am her trustee. Of funds, not thoughts." He turned to Julian. "This is precisely the danger. The woman has established a private code with a vulnerable girl, and now bars the family from it." Julian felt the old fear rise. What if the very privacy that helped Eleanor was also a wall? What if Mariam understood his sister better, because she had made herself necessary? He hated the thought, and hated Edmund for placing it in him. "Eleanor may decide," he said at last. They asked her in the music room. Eleanor listened, took the folio, and held it against her chest. Then she shook her head. Edmund's expression became grave. "You see possessiveness, secrecy. This is not improvement." Eleanor struck the piano lid with her palm too much. Mariam moved toward her, but Edmund stepped between them. Julian seized his cousin's arm and removed him with controlled force. The moment should have proved where Julian stood. Instead, Mariam had seen his hesitation before it. Trust did not always break at the final action. Sometimes it cracked in the second when someone considered whether you might be exactly what your enemy claimed. That evening, Eleanor brought the folio to Julian's study. She placed it on his desk and opened to the first page. 3 black notes and 1 bar line. She turned each page herself, allowing him to see the dates, the exercises, the growing complexity, and the written phrases that had become household signs. On one page Mariam had written, "E chooses what this means." On another, "No progress is owed to an audience." Eleanor stopped at a composition begun 3 weeks earlier. The title, in her own hand, was "The Road in Rain." The music began with a repeated low figure, like wheels over ruts. A sharp dissonance appeared in the 4th measure. Then silence. Then 3 descending notes. Julian's chest tightened. "Is this the accident?" Eleanor did not answer. She placed 1 finger over the dissonance and then pointed toward the covered portrait of their father, visible through the open study door. Julian thought she blamed herself, or their father, or the storm. He asked too many questions at once. Eleanor closed the folio, took it, and left. Mariam found him later in the library. "You treated a page like a witness you could interrogate," she said. "She showed it to me. She chose to show you the work. She did not promise an explanation." Julian paced once to the fire and back. "Edmund is seeking authority to remove her from this house. I need facts. Then earn them. Time may not permit your methods." Time did not create her silence. Pressure did. He stopped before her. "You speak as though I am the danger." Mariam's face held sorrow rather than anger. "Sometimes, the person most afraid of losing us grips hardest. That does not make the grip safe." The sentence remained with him through a sleepless night. He remembered the accident, report the storm, the broken wheel pin, his father's insistence on traveling, despite warning. He remembered Edmund arriving before dawn, already composed, already suggesting which physician should examine Eleanor. He remembered his sister, waking and recoiling, when Edmund approached. At the time, everyone had attributed it to confusion. Now the folio's dissonance and her refusal of Edmund carried a changed meaning. Julian had believed Eleanor's silence contained only grief. It might also contain knowledge she did not trust him to receive. The next day, he asked Mariam how to proceed. Not ordered. asked. They sat in the music room, while Eleanor walked in the garden with Mrs. Penrose. Stop making speech the price of belief, Marian said. If she tells you through music, slate, or gesture, receive the meaning before demanding the form you prefer. Julian looked at the folio resting in its locked drawer. And if I misunderstand, say that you may misunderstand. She has lived among people who translate her certainty into illness. Your uncertainty might be the safest thing in the house. When Eleanor returned, Julian placed the Carriage report on the piano and then stepped away. I think your piece concerns the accident, he said. I may be wrong. I will not ask you to speak. I will believe whatever form you choose. Eleanor stood near the door. Wet grass, darkening the hem of her dress. She looked at Mariam. Mariam did nothing. The choice had to cross the room without being carried. Eleanor opened the folio to the road in rain and played. The low wheel figure began. At the dissonance, she stopped and took Julian's hand. She pressed his index finger to the sharp note, then wrote on her slate, before bridge. She turned the page and wrote, Edmund came. Father angry. Papers. Then wheel later. Julian read the words until they blurred. Edmund had met the carriage before the bridge on the Western Road. He had argued with their father over trust papers. Eleanor had seen him near the rear wheel afterward. She had tried to tell the first physician, but Edmund was in the room. The physician called her confused. After that, she stopped giving adult sounds they could turn against her. Julian's fury was immediate, cold, and nearly useless. He wanted Edmund arrested, struck, exposed. Eleanor saw it and backed away. Mariam touched his sleeve once. Receive the meaning first. He forced his hands open. Her knelt, not to dramatize remorse, but to bring himself below his sister's guarded eyes. I believe you, he said. I am sorry. Belief took me this long. You owe me no more tonight. Eleanor stared at him. Then she touched 2 fingers to his lips. Not silencing him, simply marking enough. The midpoint of their work was not Eleanor's first spoken word. It was the night Julian learned that silence had protected her when family failed. Every earlier refusal changed meaning. The locked music room door had not been childish defiance. The covered portrait had not been denial. Her refusal to let Edmund read the folio was evidence of judgment, not dependence. Julian spent the following morning reviewing trust papers and carriage expenses. But for once he did not turn discovery into command. He told Eleanor what he planned, asked what she wanted, and accepted her written answer, not yet public. Keep Marian. Keeping Mariam became the center of the conflict, because Edmund understood her value too. He spread the claim that an ambitious teacher had planted memories in a grieving girl. Letters reached Julian's aunt, the bishop's wife, and 2 magistrates. One described Mariam as a person of obscure origin, exercising improper influence. Another suggested Eleanor's composition had been manufactured. Julian's instinct was to announce an engagement to Mariam, believing his name would place her beyond insult. The thought shocked him with its clarity. He loved her. He also recognized that using marriage as armor before asking her would repeat the pattern she had warned against. He chose another form of control instead. His solicitor advised that Mariam's continued residence could be presented as proof that Eleanor remained under influence. If the teacher left voluntarily, while an independent physician assessed the girl, Edmund's petition would lose force. Julian arranged a generous payment. Rooms for Mariam, with a respectable widow in Bath, and a letter of recommendation signed by 3 county families. He told himself he was preserving her reputation and Eleanor's legal position. He did not ask either woman what the loss of their daily work would do. Mariam listened in the music room while he explained. Eleanor sat at the pianoforte, fingers motionless above the keys. Julian kept his voice calm because he mistook calmness for fairness. It will be 6 weeks. Perhaps less. You will be fully paid. Mrs. Caro's house is excellent, and Bath would offer pupils of means. Mariam looked at the packed trunk already placed near the door by a footman who had received orders before she had. You have dismissed me. Temporarily, after arranging where I will live. I was trying to ensure you were not exposed. You were trying to make your case cleaner. The sentence landed with the same hard precision as her first answer about miracles. You believe Eleanor. You believe me. Yet when outsiders demand proof of our integrity, you remove the inconvenient woman and call it protection. Julian's face tightened. If Edmund succeeds, he may take Eleanor to Larkhaven. Then fight the lie. Do not make me disappear so the truth looks more respectable. He reached for her hand. Mariam stepped back. You have not learned to ask when fear tells you speed is virtue. Eleanor struck the piano lid once with her palm too much. Julian turned toward her. She wrote on the slate, Mariam stays. He answered, I am trying to keep you home. Eleanor wrote beneath it, home, without choice. She left the room with the folio under her arm. Julian followed. But Mariam stopped him with a quiet word. Let her go. He looked at the closed door and understood too late that he had used the threat of removal to justify removing the one person Eleanor had chosen. Mariam left Ravensmere the following morning. Not for Bath, but for Bellcross village, 2 miles from the estate. She rented the upper room of the chapel school from the minister, who had known her father's music. The space held 1 square piano, 8 mismatched chairs, and a window overlooking the burial ground. It was not elegant. It was hers for 12 shillings a week. She sent Julian back, the Bath arrangement unsigned, and enclosed an invoice for the lessons completed. No severance fee. No recommendation requested. Eleanor refused the independent physician. She refused to enter the music room. At meals, she wrote only necessary words. Julian did not punish, gradually, or summon Mariam back, though every silent corridor made the decision taste worse. He reviewed the solicitor's advice and saw how eagerly he had accepted a path that required no trust from him. Only action. He had told himself the case demanded sacrifice, while selecting sacrifice from someone else's life. 3 days after Mariam left, Eleanor appeared in his study carrying 2 sheets. The first was the page on which she had written Mariam stays. The second was Julian's letter, dismissing Mariam, which Eleanor had taken from the music room table. She placed them side by side and drew an equal sign. Julian stared. You think I am like Edmund? She shook her head. Then she wrote, Samador. Different hand. He felt the truth more deeply than accusation. Edmund wanted to confine her for power. Julian had confined choices for love. Motiva mattered. So did the door. What do you want me to do? He asked. Eleanor wrote, Ask her. The simplicity was devastating. Julian rode to Bellcross in rain, arrived with mud to his knees, and found Mariam teaching 4 children to clap around. He waited outside the open door until the lesson ended. She saw him from the first minute and did not shorten it. When the children left, she closed the piano and said, Your Grace. He remained near the threshold. I came to ask what repair you would accept. Not whether I will return. I want you to return. That cannot be the first question. Mariam leaned against the piano. Fatigue showed beneath her composure. Leaving had cost her too. And she refused to pretend otherwise, merely because his error was clear. Eleanor wants lessons. I will teach her here, if she chooses to come. The chapel room is public. which answers the accusation of secret influence. Mrs. Penrose may attend. So may you. If Eleanor places a chair, and Ravensmere, I will not live in your house, while my presence can be converted into a favor, granted or withdrawn by your fear. Julian accepted the words without arguing their severity. I will provide a carriage for Eleanor. Mariam raised one eyebrow. He corrected himself. May I offer a carriage for Eleanor? Under Mrs. Penrose's direction. Without conditions, you may offer. She may refuse. He almost smiled. But the moment deserved more than charm. I am sorry, not for the scandal or for acting too quickly. I am sorry I made your absence serve my respectability. Mariam heard in the apology what had been missing before. He had named the benefit he took from the wrong. That is closer, she said. Closer to forgiveness, closer to understanding. He nodded. Then I will continue. He left without asking to stay for tea, without placing money on the piano, and without looking back to see whether she watched. She did watch. Changed behavior was rarely as dramatic as confession. Sometimes it was a man leaving when he had not yet received relief. Eleanor accepted the carriage, but insisted it stop at the edge of Bellcross so she could walk the final street. The first lesson in the chapel room drew attention. Villagers found reasons to pass the open window. Edmund's man waited near the churchyard gate. Mariam ignored them. She placed the folio on the square piano and asked Eleanor, "Do you wish to continue The Road in Rain?" Eleanor wrote, "Finish it." Julian sat in the chair she had placed at the back. The new section of the composition did not resolve into sweetness. After the broken wheel dissonance came a long rest. Then a single note, repeated by different hands. Eleanor played the right-hand note. Mariam added an alto note beneath it. She looked at Julian. The cello rested beside his chair. He had brought it without being asked. He found the matching tone. 3 sounds, separate and held, created a chord that none could make alone. Eleanor wrote the harmony into the folio, and beneath it added, "Believed." Lessons became rehearsals for a small public musicale at the Bellcross chapel. The minister proposed it to raise money for a new school roof. Mariam agreed because ordinary purpose was its own defense. Eleanor chose to perform. Julian offered the Ravensmere music room and accepted her refusal. He sent no invitations under ducal seal. But county families heard the Duke would play a cello in a village chapel and developed sudden concern for roof slates. Edmund objected, formally. He wrote that public exhibition of a distressed girl was indecent and that Mariam's commercial use of Eleanor proved exploitation. Julian showed the letter to both women before replying. Eleanor wrote, "My choice." Mariam said, "Answer only that." Julian's response contained 4 words. Lady Eleanor has chosen. He signed it. He did not mention his rank. Edmund's motives. Or Mariam's virtue. A clear boundary required less ink than control. Meanwhile, Julian investigated the accident without turning Eleanor into an instrument. He examined the carriage records with Pritchard and the old coachman, who had survived with a crushed leg and retired. The man remembered that Edmund had intercepted the carriage at Marsh Gate, arguing with the late Duke over an amendment to Eleanor's trust. He also remembered finding the rear retaining pin, replaced after the crash, with a softer brass one. Unsuitable for the axle. No one had kept it. The testimony proved opportunity and negligence in the earlier inquiry. But not sabotage. The folio supplied the detail that made the old evidence useful. On the back of The Road in Rain, Eleanor drew the object she had seen in Edmund's hand, a narrow pin with a crescent-shaped head. Julian recognized the design from a traveling tool set his cousin carried, custom-made with the Ashford crescent. He did not praise her memory or press for more. He asked whether she would allow the drawing to be copied for the magistrate. She wrote, "After music." The public performance, not the investigation, remained her priority. Julian watched her world grow beyond Ravensmere. The sight produced pride and fear together. If she no longer needed his house, she might never choose it again. His old instinct whispered that he should offer a grand music school, secure her position, attach her future to his resources. He recognized the voice now. Instead, he paid the same lesson fee as the miller and accepted a receipt. When the chapel piano needed a new hammer, he offered to locate a craftsman and waited until Mariam said yes. They spoke after rehearsals, while Eleanor walked back with Mrs. Penrose. Julian carried the cello, Mariam the folio, and neither hurried. He told her about his shoulder wound and the night he learned his father had died. She told him about her father being denied a cathedral post after an examiner praised his playing but questioned whether the congregation would accept him. He built his own choir, she said. He taught clerks, laundresses, sailors, and any child who could keep time. He said a closed door could be useful if it showed you where to build another room. Is that what you are doing in Bellcross? Julian asked. Yes. And is there a place for me in it? Mariam looked ahead at the chapel roof, where evening light traced the damaged slates. There may be a chair at the back. He received the answer without disappointment. A chair honestly offered was worth more than a room entered by right. The week before the Musicale, Edmund escalated. He arrived at Bellcross with a physician, a magistrate, and a closed carriage bearing the discreet crest of Larkhaven. He had obtained a temporary order permitting medical examination, not removal, but he presented it as authority to take Eleanor. The girl saw the carriage through the chapel window and went white. Her fingers locked around the edge of the piano. Mariam closed the keyboard lid and stood beside her. Not in front. Julian met Edmund at the gate. The order allows an examination at her residence. Edmund smiled. The village chapel has become her residence in every meaningful sense. Look at the crowd. The woman displays her for money. Julian's fist tightened, then opened. You will address Miss Cole by name. Edmund lowered his voice. You risk the dukedom for an ambitious colored music mistress and a hysterical girl's composition. The insult was designed to provoke violence and turn Julian's protection into evidence of instability. Julian did not give him the scene. He looked toward the chapel. Eleanor had come to the doorway with Mariam. She held the folio in one hand and her slate in the other. Julian asked, Do you consent to speak with the physician here? With Miss Cole and Mrs. Penrose present, Eleanor wrote no and held it up. The magistrate shifted uneasily. Edmund said, A child cannot understand. Eleanor struck the chapel's hanging handbell once. The clear note cut through every voice. She wrote another line and showed the magistrate, I understand, removal. I refuse. Then she turned the page. I will perform Saturday. You may observe. The magistrate read both and told Edmund the order did not authorize force. The Larkhaven carriage left empty. No one cheered. Eleanor returned to the piano, sat down, and shook so violently she could not place her hands on the keys. Mariam sat beside her without speaking. Julian remained outside until Eleanor tapped 2 slow beats on the window frame. Again, this time, she was inviting him in. The fright left a cost. Eleanor did not sleep for 2 nights and scratched out an entire page of the composition. Mariam let her destroy that page, but kept the torn pieces in an envelope at the back of the folio because Eleanor asked her to. Julian moved no guards into Bellcross. He posted 1 constable at the road only after Eleanor agreed. Each choice slowed action. Each choice returned a small part of the world to her. On Friday evening, Mariam found Julian alone in the chapel trying to tune the cello. Your A string is sharp, she said. My entire character has been described similarly. She took the peg between her fingers. Their hands brushed. Neither moved away. The weeks of restraint, anger, repair, and walking side by side gathered in that small contact. I wanted to announce that I loved you, he said. When Edmund first wrote, Mariam's hand still. Why didn't you? Because I realized I wanted the announcement to solve what asking might endanger. He looked at her. I do love you. I am not asking you to answer before the performance, or after it, or at all. I am saying something true because I have spent too much of my life turning truth into strategy. Mariam felt the words enter without crowding her. She had feared that loving a duke would make every choice appear purchased. Every achievement attributed to his name. He was beginning to understand that fear, without demanding she make it convenient. I love you too, she said. His breath changed. She continued before relief became assumption. And I will not return to Ravensmere as a dependent teacher who may be dismissed for the household's benefit. I am building something here. If there is a future, it must make more room, not close mine. Then we will discuss the room when you are ready. His gaze dropped briefly to her mouth and returned to her eyes. May I kiss you? Mariam smiled. You may. The kiss was quiet and specific. Not a reward for suffering or a promise that conflict had ended. His hand rested at her waist with reverence for the generous shape other people had treated as an invitation to judge. Hers touched the scarred line beneath his shoulder through his coat. When they parted, the cello string had slipped flat again. Mariam plucked it. Still wrong. I have been given reason to hope for adjustment. Saturday's Musicale filled the chapel beyond capacity. Farmers stood along the rear wall beside county ladies who had never before entered Bellcross without charitable purpose. Mrs. Penrose guarded the Folio. Pritchard managed chairs with military seriousness. The small stage held the square piano, Julian's cello, and 8 local pupils who would open with a round. Mariam wore a deep green gown with gold thread at the cuffs, chosen because it pleased her rather than because it made her appear modest. Eleanor wore ivory and carried no slate. The first half proceeded without incident. The children sang. The stonemason's son played a melody by ear. The farmer's wife performed 4 measures, stopped, began again, and received the warmest applause of the evening. Mariam conducted from the center with calm authority. Julian watched from his chair and understood that her gift was not making one damaged noble girl exceptional. It was building a space where imperfect attempts were received as work rather than shame. Edmund entered before Eleanor's piece. He had no order this time. Only 2 relatives, and the confidence of a man who believed public doubt could accomplish what law had not. He waited until Mariam announced The Road in Rain. Composed and performed by Lady Eleanor Ashford. Composed, he said loudly, or dictated by the person who profits from displaying her. Unease moved through the chapel. Eleanor's hands froze above the keys. Mariam did not defend herself first. She looked at Eleanor and asked, Do you wish to continue? Eleanor nodded. Edmund stepped into the aisle. A nod from a girl under influence proves nothing. Julian rose. Every eye turned toward the Duke. He could have ordered Edmund removed. Instead, he carried his chair from the side of the stage and placed it beside Mariam. Not in front of her. Lady Eleanor chooses whether to play, he said. Miss Cole chooses whether to conduct. I am here by their invitation. Edmund laughed softly. And when the girl fails before this audience, Julian looked at his sister. Then she will have chosen to attempt something difficult. And no failure will make her less worthy of belief. The answer changed the room. Eleanor lowered her hands to the keys. The Road in Rain began. The low wheel rhythm moved through the chapel. Steady and ominous. Mariam entered with the alto line. Julian drew the bow across the cello and gave the piece its dark foundation. At the sharp dissonance, several listeners flinched. Eleanor stopped. Silence held. Edmund smiled. Believing the break was collapse, Eleanor lifted her hands. She turned on the bench and faced the room. For 11 months, everyone had waited for her voice as proof that she had returned to them. When it came, it was rough from disuse and quieter than expectation. He touched the wheel, she said, looking at Edmund. 4 words. No ornament. No ambiguity. The chapel did not move. Edmund's face changed before he controlled it. Surprise first. Then calculation. This is suggestion. Eleanor opened the folio to the drawing of the crescent-headed pin and held it up. The magistrate from the chapel gate stepped forward. He had returned by choice to hear the performance. Julian did not interpret for her. Mariam did not prompt. Eleanor spoke again. Each word costing effort. I saw him. Before the bridge. Father refused the paper. The old coachman stood from the rear pew with a cane in both hands. His presence was not a surprise arranged for drama. Julian had invited him to the Musicale because Eleanor had written that she wanted him to hear the finished road music. He looked at the drawing and said he remembered the crescent tool in Edmund's case and the soft replacement pin found after the wreck. The evidence did not become a courtroom in the chapel. It became enough for the magistrate to say the accident inquiry would reopen, and Edmund should not leave the county. Edmund turned to Julian. You would destroy your family name, on the word of a distressed girl and a hired woman. Julian's answer came without volume. My family name was damaged when we made Eleanor's silence an excuse not to believe her. Miss Cole restored no name. She restored our capacity to listen. He faced the audience. Her work is hers. Her method is hers. The school forming in this chapel is hers. My gratitude gives me no ownership of any of it. Then he looked at Mariam. Will you conduct the final movement? It was the public recognition she would remember, not a declaration that he had chosen her, but an acknowledgement that the music waited for her judgment. Mariam took her place. Eleanor returned to the keys. The final movement began with one note repeated by different hands. Piano. Voice humming beneath it. Cello. The local pupils joined from the front pew with the simple chord Mariam had taught them. The piece ended not in triumph but in held harmony. Each part audible. None erased. The applause rose slowly, because people needed a moment to remember how. Eleanor did not smile. She closed the folio, pressed both palms to its cover, and breathed. Julian approached only after she nodded. He embraced her without lifting her from the ground, without saying she was cured, without asking for another word. She rested her forehead against his shoulder. Mariam stood beside them, not inside a perfect family picture, but within reach. Edmund was charged weeks later with interfering in the carriage and attempting to suppress testimony. The inquiry concluded he had loosened the retaining pin to delay the journey. After Julian's father refused to sign a trust amendment, he claimed he never intended the crash. Intent did not restore the dead. He lost his trusteeship, repaid funds he had improperly drawn, and left the county under a sentence that restricted his movement for several years. Eleanor gave one written statement and refused every request to repeat the story socially. Julian protected that refusal. The Trumut was placed under 2 new trustees chosen with Eleanor's consent, Miss Penrose and a retired judge who had known her mother. Julian remained her brother, not the owner of her future. Larkhaven's carriage never returned. Eleanor spoke when she wished and used music, writing, or silence when those suited her better. Some days she said a dozen words, some days none. No one called the quiet days relapse. Mariam registered the Bellcross School of Music under her own name that summer. The building fund came from lesson fees, chapel donations, and a limited gift from Ravensmere accepted under a written condition that the Duke acquired no governing authority. She leased the former assembly room above the market and filled it with instruments repaired rather than replaced. Her father's portrait hung near the entrance, not as a saint, but as a working musician with ink on his sleeve. When Julian proposed, he did so in the empty schoolroom before the chairs arrived. He brought no ring at first, only a draft settlement prepared after 3 weeks of questions. The school, its income, Mariam's teaching methods, and all published music under her name would remain her separate property. She could live part of each week in Bellcross if she chose. Ravensmere would provide scholarships by contract, not patronage, and Eleanor's lessons would continue only at Eleanor's request. Mariam read the pages while Julian waited beside the square piano. "Your solicitor disliked this," she said. He used the phrase, domestic irregularity. I told him our domestic life had suffered enough from other people's preference for regularity. She looked up. "And if I never become comfortable in your drawing rooms, then the drawing rooms will be uncomfortable. If county ladies call the school a vanity, they may pay admission before expressing the opinion." Her laugh filled the empty room and made it feel occupied. He grew serious. "I cannot promise never to be afraid. I can promise fear will not be permitted to make your choices in secret." Mariam touched the place on the settlement where her school was named. "And I cannot promise never to leave a room when I am angry. I have learned doors can remain unlocked." He took one breath. "Mariam Cole, will you marry me and continue becoming more yourself than my title knows how to contain?" She amended one clause, so the scholarship board would include 2 teachers elected by their peers. Then she signed, yes. Their wedding was held at the Bellcross Chapel in early autumn, with the repaired roof above them and the square piano against one wall. Mariam wore plume, the color of the traveling dress in which she had first ordered Ravensmere's shutters opened. When the register was signed, Mariam wrote Cole between her given name and Ashford and kept it in every professional notice thereafter. At the breakfast, no one asked Eleanor to speak. She chose to toast them with 3 sentences, paused, and finished the rest by playing the altered air their mother had written. Julian accompanied her badly on cello. Mariam corrected his tempo in front of everyone. He corrected it without protest. Pritchard, seated beside Mrs. Penrose, observed that his grace had lasted longer than a fortnight under instruction. Mrs. Penrose replied that the teacher had always been the more durable party. Ravensmere's music room reopened, but it no longer belonged to Grief or to the ducal family alone. Once each month, Bellcross pupils came to play there. The portraits remained subject to Eleanor's choice. Her father's stayed covered for another year. Her mother's received fresh flowers only when Eleanor placed them herself. Julian asked, before moving either cloth. The practice became so ordinary that visitors found it strange only once. Mariam divided her week between the school and Ravensmere. She travelled in a carriage purchased by the school, not the estate. With her name painted discreetly on the door, her full figure, dark skin, and commanding presence became familiar at markets, recitals, and county houses that had once questioned whether she was suitable to enter. Some people revised themselves, others merely learned to behave. Mariam required conduct, not conversion, from those who had no place in her intimate life. Eleanor completed The Road in Rain as the first piece printed by the Bellcross School. The title page named her composer and Mariam editor. Julian's name appeared nowhere except in a short dedication Eleanor chose, "For my brother, who learned the rest is also music." The proceeds funded 2 student places. Edmund's name did not appear at all. He remained a fact in the composition, not its owner. 1 year after Mariam arrived, she returned to the Ravensmere music room before breakfast. The shutters were closed against an early March chill. The black pianoforte had been polished, the chairs arranged for that afternoon's pupils, and the leather folio rested on its own shelf. Julian entered carrying the small wooden metronome she had brought on her first day. Its case had cracked. "I was told this could be repaired," he said. "By whom? The instrument maker in Bellcross. I asked whether you wanted it repaired before sending it." Mariam took the metronome, ran her thumb along the crack, and smiled at the evidence of the question. "Yes." Eleanor came in behind him, hair loose over her shoulders, carrying a new folio. She crossed to the first shutter and opened it. Morning light spread over the keys. Mariam remembered the man who had said music was not medicine, and the woman she had been when she answered that patience required open shutters. She had been right, though not completely. Music had not cured Eleanor. It had given choice a form. It had not erased Julian's fear. It had taught him to hear the silence before acting. It had not rescued Mariam from dependence. She had built a room with its own door and invited love to enter. Julian placed a chair near the piano, then paused with his hand on its back. "May I?" he asked Eleanor. She looked at Mariam, then at her brother, and tapped 2 beats on the polished wood. Again. He sat. Mariam opened the new folio to its blank first page. Outside, Ravensmere's grounds were still grey with winter. But inside, the room held the soft disorder of people preparing to make something that had not existed before. Eleanor played 1 note. Mariam answered with another. Julian lifted the cello and waited for the count. No one demanded a miracle. No one mistook silence for absence. The shutters stood open. The cracked metronome waited for repair. And each person entered the music by choice,